Welcome to the Speak Like a Leader podcast with John Bates. Welcome to the show. With me today, I've got someone that I think you, like I think you're just going to love him. I love him. He's a really, really great guy who has some incredible stories to share, some incredible lessons. He started out in the corporate world, then he went into private equity, had some tremendous success there, had an awakening, and now he makes a really big difference for entrepreneurs who want to scale up their business and learn the lessons that he learned in private equity, but apply them on the business owner entrepreneur side. So with me today is Nick Bradley. He is the host of, I think it's the most popular business podcast in the UK, Scale Up with Nick Bradley. You can find him at suyb.global. That's Scale Up Your Business, suyb.global. And if you want to connect with him, you can find him on linkedin.com/in/the real Nick Bradley. So that's linkedin.com/in/the real Nick Bradley. And of course, we'll have that in the show notes. So Nick, welcome to the show. Did I get that right?
You got that 100% right, John. So that was good. Very good.
That's really cool. And you know, on your podcast, Scale Up Your Business, we've got a mutual friend in Mike McKelowitz, yeah?
We do. He was on the show. It must be about 18 months ago, maybe even 2 years. I lose track of time with this whole COVID thing.
Yeah.
But he came on, telling his story and what he does. And there's quite a lot of synergy between what he does and what I do. Maybe different parts of the entrepreneurial journey, which we can get into. But I love Mike. You know, he's got so much passion for helping entrepreneurs and business owners, get something from their business in terms of freedom, wealth, and impact, which is very aligned to my stuff as well.
Yeah, it's awesome. And he was actually the first, my first guest on this podcast. He's the guy who helped me with my maiden voyage. So very cool. He's going to be joining me again pretty soon, just to kind of circle back. So I'm excited about that. And, knowing what you do and knowing who's listening, I think there is just a lot that we can learn from you, both in the corporate space and also in the entrepreneurial space. Tell us, why don't you just tell us your story? Because I know that there's that moment that something big happened and you had a realization that has you doing what you're doing now. But I'd also love to hear, how you got to that,
Yeah. So what do they say? The long story, as succinctly as possible. Because there's it's a little bit like John, some sort of Shakespeare play with different acts and scenes. I'll give you the sort of the way it builds actually, because there's some quite interesting points in there which maybe give some insights into how I think as well, which will help people because I've gone through my own transitions and transformations, probably the best way to say it. So I started off living in a place called Adelaide, which is in South Australia. So everyone listening here, I've got this kind of weird accent. I've got this sort of Australian, sort of UK Brit accent because I've spent the last 20 years living over here, and I'll get to the reason how that all happened shortly. But Adelaide's an interesting place. I love it. It's very sort of country town, if you know what I mean by that sort of metaphor. But not a lot happens there. And unless you're going to become a stockbroker, a lawyer, doctor, maybe, all those sort of things, if you want to go and, make your fortune somewhere, you're probably best placed to leave and go somewhere more connected. But as the story goes, I actually started a business when I was in my late teens. It was a personal training business. And we're talking back in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. So personal trainers back then were not as common as they are now. They were the ones that, only the rich people could afford. So hence my clientele was those stockbrokers, lawyers, doctors. And it was a successful business in terms of I was doing a certain number of hours. I was studying a marketing and finance degree at university in Adelaide at the time. And I had 3 staff members. Okay, so I had a lot of cash for a young guy. But I grew up in a situation where my family wasn't that entrepreneurial. And, your environment is everything, right? And I had all these different voices saying to me, oh, is it going to work? It's a bit risky starting a business. Surely you should go into the sort of corporate world, and that world's a safer place. It's about security and all these sort of things. So the funny part of the story is I started this business, sold it 3 years later for 3,000 Australian dollars, which is about like a Starbucks coffee these days, something like that.
Yeah.
And I kind of just sort of fell into this, well, I'm going to go get a job. And I ended up going to Sydney from Adelaide. One of my clients in the personal training studio knew Rupert Murdoch, who owns News International. And I got introduced to his nephew, I believe, a guy called Matt Hambry. And I got a job working in the media game for the bigger part of News International as the marketing manager of Men's Health magazine in Australia. So this was pretty cool. And I got to kind of hang out in Sydney, go surfing in the mornings, end up going to work in the afternoons. It was a great lifestyle for a number of years. And it got me into this kind of corporate rat race, if you want to call it that. But I loved it because I was just having fun, and I got promoted, and I was getting pretty good at the job and all that. I ended up going from News International to a UK-based publisher that had an outpost, if you want to call it that, in Sydney, a business called EMAP, East Midlands Allied Press. And effectively what happened is I did quite well there, that they offered me the opportunity to move over to the UK in 2003. And that secondment for 9 months ended up turning into what is now almost 20 years. So that's all really cool, right? Sounds interesting. I kind of...
Yeah, it's really cool. And by the way, surfing in Sydney is about the greatest thing on this earth.
Yeah, listen, it was good. It was 6 a.m, and we're out there literally surfing until 7:30, and then just getting on a bus. Right? It was amazing lifestyle. The reason I give the detail here is there's a few things that I'm going to come back to and frame, I think, as lessons along the way. Because as I was kind of going up the ranks, I had this sort of feeling that I wasn't really doing what I was meant to do, and how that manifested is that as I kept getting promoted, I kept also having a lot of internal battles with myself. Am I doing really what I'm meant to do? And then as I started to get up the ranks, I started to get quite chippy and quite aggressive. And I kept getting kind of promoted and sacked, right? Continuously. and like, I just didn't like authority, and I didn't like some of the decisions being made. So I segued out of the corporate world around 2008, and I went to New York and worked for a company called Getty Images. And Getty Images, unbelievable business. But at the time of joining, I didn't quite realize that it was backed by private equity. You mentioned my career in private equity, and this was the sort of first sort of shift, if you like, into this world. Now, for those who don't know what private equity is where you have a firm that raises private investment from high net worth individuals, endowments, pension funds. And then they'll go and invest in companies, they'll acquire companies, and then they'll scale those companies normally via other acquisitions. It's called a buy and build or a roll up. And then they'll sell the group for stupendous amounts of money, like billions, right? All that sort of thing. And I got into that by luck. But because I was this kind of aggressive, quite focused, resilient chap, going into that sort of predominantly alpha male environment suited me brilliantly at the time. And so for the next, 5, 6, 7 years, I was going into businesses that were failing and private equity backed businesses that were failing. And I was the guy that would do the turnaround and the scale up. Okay. Now to put some color in on this, when you go into these businesses like this, like you've really got to go in there and almost pull them apart and put them back together. You've got to sack people. You've got to make all these tough decisions. And after a period of time, you almost become unemotional and detached because you're working with such big numbers in terms of what you're trying to build, and you're going to have to make these tough decisions. And I did that successfully, as I said, for that sort of 6, 7 years. But I started to get really, I was feeling funny before this, but as I started to get into this world and I started to get into the, so much money, so much power, and so many egos, I started to really feel sick and just didn't feel right in myself. And this is where it kind of sort of all comes together a bit. So around the age of 34, 35, I was about to have my first child. And I got an email. And the email was from my dad. Now, what you don't know is that my dad actually left when I was 2 years of age. And so I was brought up by my mum. My grandfather was a big influence. And I had no real connection, but I had this feeling that there was something missing, as I think anyone who has a parent who's not around feels, right? I didn't really contextualize that at the time. But I got this email and he wanted to come back into my life. Now, little did I know at this point, John, that my wife had done the meddling behind the scenes. And I'm like, what are you doing? You know, what's going on? This is going to, you know, I've got all this stuff. I'm trying to sell businesses, you know, and I was just not a very nice person to be around. I was just so stressed, right? So stressed. And then he comes back, you know, writes this email and we decide to meet. We decide to connect. So he comes, he's living in Australia at this point in time. He comes over to the UK. We meet in this pub, lots of tears, all sorts of things going on. And that then sparks a whole myriad of things that happens.
As it will.
As it does. So first and foremost, the reason that I didn't have that connection for 30 odd years is that, you know, everyone around me at the time said he was such an ass. Not a very nice guy. He left when you were 2. He doesn't love you, all the sort of things that you would expect. When I met the guy, you hear the second side of the story, right? And what I found out was that he was a very, very successful entrepreneur. He was a millionaire before he was 40. Then he lost his first business in a terrorist attack in Melbourne. Crazy stuff, right? Where the Turkish consulate was bombed in Collins Street a number of years ago. He then had to go, he lost everything, had to go back into the world of work, and then he built himself up again. He started another business before he was in his 50s, and then he was a millionaire again. That was one part of the story. The other part of the story, he was just a nice guy. You know, he had lots of people around him, and he was always, if you went out for a meal with him or something, he'd go into the kitchen and say thank you to the chefs and all this sort of stuff. So I'm going, well, hold on. First and foremost, everything I knew growing up wasn't real. This entrepreneurial spark that I started when I was 18 and also carried through when I started getting sacked from my corporate jobs is partly because I'm actually more entrepreneurial than I gave myself credit for. And now I'm in this world where I'm out there, you know, going into businesses and ripping them apart and making all this money for shareholders and investors. And everything's starting to crash around me because my values and what I think I was brought into the world to do were conflicted against what I now was leaning into and what I felt I really wanted to do. Okay?
Yeah.
Then, after my dad's come back into my life for a couple of years, he's, you know, my daughter's born. We've had a couple of trips away. You know, I've connected with him. What I thought was going to be a terrible situation ends up being an amazing situation. He gets diagnosed with cancer. And within the space of 8 months, he passes away.
I'm so sorry, Nick.
Yeah, it was hard, and it still is hard, but it was one of those situations where if you look back and you have hindsight, there was a massive gift in this very small part of my life, because what I got in terms of the gift of that, if I can call it that, in that space of a few years, then gave me this power to go and do what I'm doing now. So the situation that you alluded to, as all this was going on and, you know, my dad was sick and all these sort of things, I went to bed one night and we were closing a really, really big deal, a deal that ended up being in the billions. So I can give you an idea of that.
Yeah.
And at 3 a.m. in the morning, I woke up in terrible amounts of pain. And the right side of my jaw was literally just throbbing, absolutely throbbing. It felt like someone had punched me, literally punched me square in the jaw, in the face. And I thought at the time, what's happened here? Has something fallen on my head? You know, has one of the kids come in and, you know, smack me with something, whatever, right? But I got out of bed, absolute agony. I went to the mirror and I looked in the mirror and I felt around in my mouth and I could feel that there was stuff in there. And I found out that what it was little shards of teeth. And what I'd done, literally in my sleep that night, is I had crushed down on my jaw so tightly, I'd clenched my teeth so tightly that I shattered the 2 or 3 molars on the right side of my jaw. I mean, crazy, right? I mean, who does that?
Yeah.
And I remember looking in the mirror and, again, in pain. And I started to piece it together. I started to piece that this was a thing that had happened because of stress, because of all these things going on. And I remember this overriding thought. And the thought was, how did I get here? What decisions did I make to get to this point? And you know what dawned on me? Is that all those years that I was scaling and exiting businesses, what I was doing was going in there and being, really cutthroat. And as I said, I was making all these investors wealthy. And before that, I didn't really have any appreciation that the value in these businesses was created by the entrepreneurs, the business owners. And effectively what we were doing was taking the value that they created, doing some very clever things, but getting all the value back for ourselves. You could go as far as saying, John, that we were screwing over those entrepreneurs cleverly, right? Nothing illegal, cleverly, but just not morally.
Yeah.
And as I looked into the mirror that night, I realized that the people that we were screwing over and I was screwing over for all those years were just like my dad.
Yeah. No.
And that was it. That was rock bottom.
Wow. That's a tough moment, huh?
Good moment now.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and listen, if somebody's listening right now and they're having a hard time, I do think that that's a good thing to keep in mind, right? Because I don't think you'd go back and change that moment, but at the moment you felt it, that was one of the lowest points of your life, if I'm tracking.
It was a compounding effect of multiple decisions I'd made over time, accelerated by meeting my dad.
Yeah.
Right. So the reason I say it's a gift, even though at the time it didn't feel like that, is had that have not happened, would I have just stayed on that pathway? And I I don't know the answer, right? But I probably would have. I wouldn't have done what I do now. We'll get into that, but I probably would have. And I was getting sick.
Yeah.
And I was treating my family and my friends like crap.
Yeah.
So who was I going to become?
Yeah. It's a really good question. So what a gift. And so then there you are, and you've had this realization. Now what do you do?
Well, I'm missing a few teeth.
Yeah. Call the dentist in the morning, right?
Yeah. The reason I didn't want to kind of tell the story too succinctly because there's a lot of different things I think people need to hear that can help them through this, which we can go through. But the next morning I went to the doctor first, actually, because I was in so much pain, and then the dentist very shortly after. And that's where I found out what had happened. I kind of knew what had happened, but it was the why behind it. So why did it happen? And the dentist actually was the one who said that she'd seen similar things before in people in investment banking and those sort of industries where
interesting
they've just mortgaged their whole world on the numbers.
Yeah.
And there's a movie. Have you ever seen American Psycho? Have you ever seen that movie? It was with Christian Bale.
I totally remember when that came out. I don't think I saw it.
There's a scene in there. I'll just kind of, because a lot of people love that film. It's a bit of a cult film. It's a weird film, but
for
it's a cult film.
For sure.
But there's a scene where Christian Bale is standing in front of the mirror in his bathroom. And he says something along the lines of, you can see there's a person, there, they've got skin, eyes, hair, whatever else. But when you look into their eyes, they're not there.
Yeah.
Something like that. And that I think that, I didn't connect with that at the time, but I saw the movie after all this had happened. I thought that was me. I was just clinical, like good at my job, but Jesus.
Yeah. Right.
So what happened was this, I obviously got the teeth thing fixed up. My father passed away, so it was around that time as well. So I was kind of mourning that. And I said to my wife, I said, listen, I need to go and do something different. And she was very supportive. And I remember connecting with a good friend of mine who had been very successful early on. He was the guy that wasn't going out drinking at university like the rest of us. He ended up retiring as a multimillionaire in his 30s. And I called him up and I said, listen, I need some help. And he said, you know what? I'm going to tell you something and you're going to not like it. And I said, okay. I said, you know how I used to go to all those seminars and events when I was younger and you guys were all playing pool and stuff like that? I'm going to suggest you go to one. And I said, listen, I'm all ears because right now what I'm doing isn't really where I want to be. And I said, I want you to go online. I want you to type in Tony Robbins. And I said, I want you to get to the next event that he's running. And I thought, I was open-minded. I wasn't like judging this. I thought, I've read his books, but I've never done anything. The guy's interesting to me, but I've never connected with this. Yeah. But I thought, you know what? I'm going to do it. So I went online. Next event was in about 3 weeks' time from the teeth incident, 3 to 4 weeks. And it was Unleash the Power Within, big event that he runs in Chicago. And I said to my wife, I'm going to do this. And she said, yep. And we actually sat down and we watched the Netflix documentary he had around, I think it's called I Am Not Your Guru. Which is great. Yeah. It's awesome. And she's like really open-minded, but she's like not in that place. She goes, you can go. Yeah. I'm not going. And so, I literally bought a ticket. I went by myself. And for 4 days, I was like crying my eyes out, John. I was like, there was some stuff there that I hadn't faced, I think, for years. And it was all kind of in me. And I understood now why I was doing what I was doing. I understood all the different things. So Nick, can I dig into that for one quick second? Oh, mate, please. What's one or two of those things? When you say that, you cried at that Unleash the Power Within, what were one or two things that were actually hitting you specifically? Can you remember? Yeah. I can remember lots, but there was one thing that jumped out straight away, which was this idea of making decisions based on fear. And I look back in hindsight and think I made a lot of decisions in my life based on that. Right. So, not going ahead with the gym that I opened when I was 18, I didn't trust myself enough to then take that forward. Right. That was one thing. And then the other thing I sort of realized is a lot of my world was based around significance and ego. And I kept leaning into that. So instead of maybe repelling it a bit and actually going to somewhere else where I'd be more fulfilled, I leant into it was almost like getting sucked into the black hole. I kept going deeper and deeper, right? If you can imagine that. Yes. And the fear thing in particular was interesting to me because they do this meditation, this kind of thing. It's called a Dickens process. Anyone who's not into woo-woo stuff is going to freak out listening to this. But that's okay. He kind of does this meditation. It's really good. And I wasn't into any of this stuff beforehand, but he gets you into a place where your eyes are closed and you have to project forward into your life over years. So next 5 years, next 10 years, next 20 years, like a long way out. Yeah. And he starts to connect you with, so what's your family like then? If you've got kids, what are your kids doing? Where are you in the, so you're starting to future pace. And there's a thing, as we did this, it's all quite full on. In my head, I kept having these words repeat over and over. Boom, 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 boom. And the words were, trust yourself, trust yourself, trust yourself. That's great. And I thought, shit, I'm going to do this. And that's why I thought, and then I came back and I made a decision on the 4th day that I was going to quit the world of private equity as I knew it then. And I came back and thought, how can I strategically transition this now? So I'm not going to do the romantic thing of just go in and resign from the private equity firm. But I'm going to now plan this out. I've made the decision. I'm not going to go back. How do I now build this on terms that are acceptable to me, but also obviously to my family? Nick, one of the things, I don't know Tony's exact approach on this, but one of the things my mom studied with Yogi Bhajan, who brought Kundalini yoga to America in the 70s. She studied with him since I think 1973. And one of the things that he would always say, that she would always tell me, is that the difference, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love
is fear.
I've heard that.
And, knowing, we've talked quite a bit. And so knowing where this goes in this process, it's really interesting to me because I think that by dropping that fear and not letting fear make your decisions anymore, you've really brought love forth in your life in a way that's just amazing. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I went to, I drank the Kool-Aid after UPW, and I went to all of his bloody events. No, it was funny actually, and the reason I bring that up is I went to one of his main events actually, which is called Date with Destiny, and you create effectively what is called your values or refine your values, and love and connection is right up there now.
There you go.
Whereas I wouldn't have written that 5 years ago, 10 years ago. In fact, I would have thought it was weak to put that there.
There you go. Listen, and Nick, I think that's really important. I just want to put a pin in this for anyone that might ever hear this, who number one is not into the woo-woo, and number two, who thinks that love and connectedness could ever be weak. I think that your lesson and your example is is really important and really powerful. And I don't think that it's unusual that there are people who would be just like that, who would be just like you were being, right?
No. I see it to this day, right? Like people, if you think about it, people who are quite aggressive around things, or, they're usually that saying that hurt people, right? It comes back from fear, or, lack of self-belief, self-worth.
Yeah.
Right. So, and, it comes back to your point. If you don't love yourself first, then your ability to show that to anybody else is compromised.
Yeah.
So you can see it. It's a big thing, bigger than I think people appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and, I think that, and I don't want to jump ahead in your story. I'd like to hear where you're going. But what I do know is that it's not like bringing love and connection to your life massively decreased your ability to be successful in the world, right?
No. And there was another thing that I learned on that first event, if you like, or that first experience with Tony, was the idea of achievement versus fulfillment.
Very good.
And so everything for me, if you were going to score my who I am and all those things prior the teeth incident, as I call it now.
Yeah.
Everything was about the next promotion, the next deal, the next, bonus, bank check, Porsche, house, right? It was all that. So it was achievement and significance. It was about looking as good as I possibly could look. Right. Even if, and this is the hard part of that, even if some of the decisions I made back then weren't the right decisions, I was so focused on achievement. Yeah. And then, but I was massively unfulfilled. So then it was about, well, if I start to help people, if I start to contribute more, if I start to think about service as opposed to the other stuff I was thinking about, how will that change things? And that's where I think I totally pivoted my belief system around that.
That's great. Yeah. That's fabulous. So then what? So
the next part of the story is an interesting one because, as I said, I made the decision to stop and change, but I didn't know what the hell I was going to do. I just knew I needed to do something. And so what I did, the first thing I did actually was I started my podcast. And
that's cool.
Yeah, it was funny actually. I was at a bowling alley around where I live with a friend, and there was a guy there who my friend, I didn't know who he was. My friend said, "Oh, he's one of the wealthiest guys around, but he's kind of got this podcast and does all this kind of interesting stuff, like speaking and I thought that's interesting, and I thought, well, I'll look into this podcasting thing." And I didn't really listen to podcasts at that stage, but I'd done a lot of speaking and everything else like that. And I thought, well, actually, I can probably share my story through a podcast, and maybe that will help people. And maybe a little bit like self-therapy, if I talk into a microphone in a darkened room, it's a little bit like journaling.
There you go.
So I did it for those reasons. I thought, well, I can help people. I can share my story because there must be other people out there who have gone through similar things or be in similar situations. And I need to have this cathartic experience where I'm getting things out.
Yeah.
No one told me to do that. It was just I was drawn to it.
Yeah.
So I started Scale Up Your Business. It's now called Scale Up with Nick Bradley. And it had this momentum behind it. I think because the first 30 episodes or so, John, were just me talking. And as you said at the beginning, it went to #1 in the UK charts, business charts.
There you go.
Stayed there for weeks, if not months. I can't remember how long it was there. And I had all these people reaching out saying, man, like, this is incredible stuff. Like both the practical stuff that I was helping people with in their businesses, but also the story of how and why.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I did that. And at the same time, I was still working for a few of the private equity firms. And I did this thing. I said, I'm going to use the podcast to start to jump onto the other side of the table. I'm not going to represent the private equity firms anymore. I'm going to represent the entrepreneurs and the business owners, the people like my dad. Yeah. And I'm going to take everything that I've learned in private equity about how you scale businesses quickly and create these amazing exits and all this value and freedom for people. And I'm going to teach that to entrepreneurs. That was the thing that started to, it wasn't clear in the beginning, but it started to become clear.
Yeah.
And then I started to get people wanting me to coach them, mentor them, whatever it was, consultancy, all those sort of things. But of course I'm employed, right? I'm employed by the private equity firms.
Right.
So what I did is I said, you know what? I know this is going to end in a way where I'm going to have to leave, but I'm going to wait until that's at the very last point. Right? The very last point.
Have it pull you out of your job.
Yeah. So I'm going to be, I called the term, I had this inverted commas, it's called being strategic. I'm going to be strategic. Yeah. And the reality was, right, and this is like, woe is Nick, but my family, my kids, right, they'd grown up, they go to a private school, they've got all these nice things around them, all this sort of stuff, right? And what I said is, if I'm going to make this life transformation, life change, I don't want them to suffer just because I'm going on this kind of, epiphany weird thing, right?
Right.
I was committed to it, but at the same time, I didn't want them to have to go through any of that.
Yeah.
So anyway, I wrote a resignation letter. I put it in my bag. And every time I went to a board meeting to discuss the deals we were doing and stuff, there was a bit of like, oh, what's this podcast? You shouldn't, perhaps you should stop the podcast. And I'm like, oh yeah, whatever. And then it just kept building and building. And I had, as I said, I had the resignation letter ready. I had it there for about 5 months. Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Look, I think it's a good way to do it. I think that's a good way to do it.
It was great. And then eventually I was pulled into a room and they said, this is it. You've got to stop the podcast or you're not working here anymore. So I reached into the bag, got the letter and said, boom.
I'm not working here anymore.
And by that time, John, I'd built enough momentum and infrastructure around Scale Up Your Business that I didn't have to rely on that anymore. So,
and listen, I want to put a quick pin in that too, because I think a lot of times people get this romantic notion of like, let's jump and we'll build the airplane on the way down. And listen, if you have to do that, great. But if you don't have to do that, I think what you did is a very smart way to do it. Like go ahead and keep your job, work on this instead of watching TV. And, at some point, what you're building will be enough to just kind of pluck you out of that job that you're trying to leave, right?
Yeah, it wasn't easy because, there was a few, at that time I was I was quite confused with everything going on.
Yes. Yeah.
But I just started to, back to that trust yourself. I just started to trust the process. I thought, well, I'm going to put out stuff. I'm going to connect with people. I'm going to help as much as I possibly can. A lot of that was for free. There was no sort of value exchange, right? Yeah. And if I can then turn this into something, based on my experience, then that's the path for now, right? And that path may change. So I became quite open-minded to, lots of different things potentially opening up. Yeah. And we're now talking about 4 years ago, right? So from where we are today. And
tell us a little bit about what you do today, like, and where you are today.
Yeah. So it's incredible. So these days I've got 7 companies, 7 separate businesses. I focus more on acquisitions than I do startups. And the reason for that is there's lots of really good businesses out there at the moment that you can buy, and you don't need to have all the money up front, right? You can go out there and buy these businesses in very clever ways. We're called leverage buyouts, but it's the stuff that I used to do in private equity. So I thought I'm going to go and acquire businesses and scale them up, and I'm going to teach other entrepreneurs and business owners how to do that. Yeah. So one of my businesses is a coaching consultancy business where we do that. And I focus specifically on that sort of scale up to an exit. So if you've got a business that's doing, let's say high 6, low 7 figures, but you think, you know what, one day I want to create freedom and wealth for myself. I don't want to be stuck in my business. I teach people how to do that as quickly as they possibly can through this background. Yeah. And it's massive. I mean, I do most of my work now out of the US. I'm still based in the UK. I mean, as we're having this conversation today, I've just got back from Dubai earlier in the month. I was in Florida 2 weeks ago. I'm going to Florida again next week. I've got friends all over the world, partly from podcasting and partly from this kind of more revised mission. I get to speak, right, on amazing stages, and that's how we connected, right? Awesome. Yeah. And I get to help people, but at the same time, build the things that I want to build creatively, financially, all that sort of stuff. And I feel about as free as I've ever felt.
Yeah. Really
because I think
cool.
I'm connected to what I'm meant to do now.
Yeah, that's fabulous. That, there's that concept of ikigai, right? Where all the, in the Venn diagram of your life, all the circles of stuff that matters, where they all overlap. And that's it's where I feel like I am. And it's where I definitely feel like you are, what makes money, what you're born to do, what you're good at, what you enjoy, all of those things.
Yes. Yeah, and I still think I'm on a journey, right? Because I think it feels like a second life. It feels like I had this first life, right? Yeah, and now I've got another life.
I totally know. I mean, it's one of the reasons I think I resonate so much with your story, because I was in that place after my company. We raised over $80 million and then went out of business in the .com crash, and I almost died of an autoimmune disease. And you've heard my story too, and I was grinding my teeth, didn't get to the point of breaking them, but I was chipping them, and I was really unhappy with where I was and myself. And I was terrified, though. I was not doing well financially. And I had nothing going on. And that moment utterly changed my life. And the other thing that I think we could probably both agree on is there is an appreciation for everything I have now that is just much more intense than probably it would have been otherwise, right?
Yeah, I think gratitude of what you have, or appreciation for what you have, is one of the big things, right?
Yeah.
Having, people, you see it when people kind of, they might have cancer and then they come back from it, right? Everyone's given them zero chance and they come back, and you see that they just then change. And I think the one thing I want to say here is, you've been through it, I've been through it. And I think we probably would agree that we were lucky that we did, in terms of, because it kind of puts you, I'm sure selling your business for billions would have been great, right? But every lesson that happens for us happens for a reason. Yeah. The key thing here, though, anyone listening, is, and this is probably my massive takeaway from what I went through, right? Is, and we talked about it briefly. If I stayed on that path, who would I have become?
Yes.
And how many people, and again, possibly people listening to this, are on this path that is killing them. Yeah. And then the question you've got to ask is, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah. Because you're right, Nick, it's actually killing them. If they're on that path that you and I were on, like, that path was killing me slowly. So I think your question is a very important one.
Yeah, I mean, I see it. I joke a little bit when I talk about this, right? About the Matrix and the two pills, the red and the blue pill. But once you've gone down one direction, or once you see things for how they are, maybe how they really are for the first time, you can't unsee them.
Yes.
And a lot of people who come into my world now who need help, I see them on this other path, the path I was on, in different ways, and I'm like, whoa, dude. Yeah, we got to take you somewhere else. And then, the obvious one is the old saying, like, you get on the subway or here at the tube in the UK, and all these people just like they just look miserable. Yeah. And you go, well, what's going to happen? Right? Are you going to be 65, 70 and then make a decision to do what you really want to do? Yeah. I know the big questions, right? But they're important. Yeah. It's your life, right? I mean, one of the things that's hitting me right now is, this is my one life. And,
this is what I have done. And this is, I don't get to go back and do my 20s again. I'm glad I, had a lot of fun. It was awesome. Could have done some things better for sure. But I mean, this is the one life that we get. And there's just no, it's just that it sounds almost silly, but it's really hitting me lately, just how profound that is.
Yeah, I think, we've all gone through pretty full on situations, right? Globally, socially, economically, and therefore emotionally, spiritually, all that. Yeah. And I think that's right? Because I mentioned before, I was in Florida, I was in Dubai, I'm off to Florida, all this sort of stuff. My wife and I, we've built businesses or build a business ecosystem around our life that supports our lifestyle. Yeah. Right? Like we don't have to live anywhere. Like, we're not tied other than kids in school, and that's important to us. Yeah. Yes. We built businesses in places we like to go on holiday. Yeah. Could you not? Like we're going to Florida, because we like to hang out in Florida. Yeah. Okay. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. And if I look back on it, it wasn't easy, but at the same time, not doing it was significantly harder. Because there you go. You know what I mean, right? Yeah. Yeah. There were good days and bad days in building these things up and having the right mindset, skill set and all that. But one of my coaches said to me, and I love this, and I've taken it to heart actually. One of my coaches said to me that somewhere in the world, right, someone's waking up with exactly what you need to get to where you want to be. Yeah. The resources, the skills, the whatever. Your job is to find that person. Right. And I thought, well, that's right. Actually, I don't have to go and build everything myself. I need to find, I found you, right, John? I needed to, I need to speak on, I did speak on stage very quickly. You came into my world somewhat serendipitously and solved the problem. Yeah. Well, and it was a total pleasure. Yeah. And to that point, Nick, we're coming up on a hard stop. I know. One of the things I just want to acknowledge you for is your embrace of what in my literature, I put a trademark on it and quote marks around it and stuff, because I just think it's so good. And you absolutely epitomize it. Insightful vulnerability. I really, really appreciate your insightful vulnerability. It's not just vulnerability. It's vulnerability with deep, meaningful, useful lessons and insights for all of us. And I know from personal experience, and I also know from every single human being that I've ever supported in the coaching that I do, that just takes something. It's scary to share these places where we've fallen down or had a problem or failed or been hurt. But when we do share those places and what we learned, that is about the best gift we can give another human being. So you have given us, I think, one of the absolute best gifts that anybody can give another person, which is your deep, meaningful, insightful vulnerability. And I appreciate it. Oh, thank you, John. I appreciate that too, coming from you as well. And all this up. Well, but just to say one thing on that, I think the more that I know that what I do and what I say and all those things now helps people, the more fulfilled I feel. Right. Yeah. And the cup was so empty before. So, I had a bit of catching up to do on that one. Boy, I hear you on that. It's when I look back on who would I have become if my company had sold, big words, had been purchased for, hundreds of millions or whatever. I'm pretty sure I would have been, I was a nice enough guy, but I would have been such a jerk. I just, I find that hard to believe, John, knowing you, but I do know lots of people who have exited their businesses and, well, actually, you know what? I know a lot of people who've become jerks from it. Yep. And then they often go off and lose it again. I know a lot of other people who have sold their businesses for what I call life-changing money and then gone on to make a bigger impact and be more philanthropic. And I think you probably would have been that guy. Well, I'll take it. I'd like to think so, but it didn't work out that way anyway. I'm glad I'm doing what I'm doing, and I'm glad I meet people like you, and I appreciate you joining us. I know we've got a hard stop in like 1 minute. Anything you want to say before we go? No, just to say, I hope, I believe this one thing, right? That the right message delivered at the right time can change something for someone, right? So
I agree.
I hope that some of the stuff I've shared today, maybe connects with people where they are on their journey and possibly inspires them to think about doing something different if what they're doing now isn't serving them.
Sounds great. And listen, maybe we could do, I don't know, in 6 months, do a part 2, because there are so many questions that I still have that I wanted to get to. So, we can circle around offline, but just know that I'm inviting you back right now for a, for a part 2 with
I'm
Nick
happy
Bradley.
to come back anytime, mate. Anytime at all, mate. Absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. Great. Well, listen, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for sharing this with us. Thank all of you for joining us. And I think you can see why I told you off the bat that I just love Nick Bradley, and I think you will too. So all of his links are in the show notes. Nick, thank you for joining us. Have a really, really great day. Thanks for joining us here on SpeakLikeALeader.show.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you for joining the Speak Like a Leader podcast. Go be awesome.